Shelby Von Holdt was born on February 8, 2001, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. She grew up in the Waynedale neighborhood, a tight-knit community on the city's southwest side. From a young age, Shelby was known for her kind and cheerful demeanor, which earned her the affection of family, friends, and neighbors. Her parents described her as a bright, caring, and determined individual who always tried to make people feel included. Shelby's childhood revolved around school, friends, and her love for animals. She was particularly fond of dogs and often volunteered at local shelters during her free time. Her family recalled her ambition to make a positive difference in the world, and she dreamed of one day becoming a veterinarian. Shelby was active in her community and known for her generosity, often helping out whenever she could. She was, by all accounts, a young woman with her entire future ahead of her. At the time of the tragic incident, Shelby was just 20 years old. She had recently graduated from high school and was exploring her next steps in life. She spent most of her days working part-time and spending quality time with her close circle of friends and family. Like many people her age, Shelby was navigating adulthood, building her independence, and working toward her goals. June 20th, 2021, began like any other summer day in the Von Holdt household. Shelby was at home in Waynedale, a familiar and comforting environment for her. Her family could never have imagined that their lives were about to be forever altered. The day would soon end in tragedy, with Shelby's name making headlines across Indiana and beyond. This is where we also introduce 23-year-old Valerie Rose Hardick, a woman Shelby had known for some time. Hardick was someone Shelby considered an acquaintance, if not a friend. The nature of their relationship was casual, though it was clear that Hardick was struggling with her own mental health challenges in the lead-up to the incident. No one could have predicted the violent turn this connection would take. By the evening of June 20th, Shelby would lose her life in a senseless act of violence. The once quiet and safe Waynedale neighborhood was shaken to its core when news spread that Shelby had been fatally shot inside her own home. The tragedy left her family devastated and a community searching for answers. This marked the beginning of a case that would uncover shocking details and leave lasting scars on everyone involved. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the early evening when an unexpected and tragic chain of events unfolded. At approximately 5:30 p.m., 23-year-old Valerie Rose Hardick arrived at Shelby's house. The two women had known each other for some time, though their relationship wasn't particularly close. Hardick had been struggling with mental health challenges and was known to display erratic behavior in recent months. Despite these challenges, Shelby had always shown kindness and patience toward Valerie, a reflection of her generous and understanding nature. It's unclear what prompted Valerie to visit Shelby that evening, but what began as an unremarkable interaction soon escalated in a way that no one could have foreseen. The encounter between Shelby and Valerie quickly turned confrontational. According to police reports and later witness testimonies, Hardick appeared to be agitated and unstable. The specifics of their argument remain unclear, but investigators would later determine that the situation spiraled out of control within minutes. At some point during their interaction, Hardick produced a firearm. The exact reason she was armed remains a mystery, but it's believed that Hardick may have brought the weapon with her, indicating some level of premeditation. What happened next sent shockwaves through the Von Holdt household and the surrounding neighborhood. Hardick fired 8 shots from a 9mm gun, striking Shelby. The young woman, who had so much to live for, collapsed in her home, succumbing to her injuries almost immediately. Shelby's body laid down there as she struggled for her life, and the brutal nature of the act left a lasting impact on everyone who knew her. Following the shooting, Hardick fled the scene, leaving behind a devastating crime that would haunt Shelby's family and the community. Shelby had managed to call 911 while she struggled for life. In the call she made, she was able to mention Hardick as the shooter. Shelby's parents returned home shortly afterward, only to discover the horrifying aftermath. They immediately called 911, and law enforcement arrived on the scene within minutes. First responders attempted to save Shelby, and she was rushed to the hospital. Shelby had to be put on life support as she also went through major surgeries. Her heart couldn't take it as it was beating too fast for her body. 3 days later, Shelby will unfortunately succumb to the gunshot wounds and was pronounced dead, leaving her family in utter shock and grief. The investigation into Shelby's death began immediately. Law enforcement secured the area and worked to gather evidence. Neighbors were interviewed, and forensic teams combed through the house for clues that might explain what had transpired. As details emerged, it became evident that Valerie Hardik was the prime suspect. Authorities issued an alert for Hardik, urging the public to come forward with any information about her whereabouts. Meanwhile, Shelby's family was grappling with the unimaginable loss of their daughter. Her parents, who had been so proud of the young woman she was becoming, were left with questions that no one could answer. Why had this happened? What could have driven Valerie to commit such a heinous act? The tragedy left a hole in their lives that could never be filled. As law enforcement launched a manhunt for Hardik, the case began to capture the attention of the community and the media. People wanted to know why this had happened and whether justice would be served. Officers quickly secured the Von Holdt home and began treating it as a crime scene. The family's grief was palpable as investigators worked to piece together what had happened. Shelby's parents were questioned extensively, though they had no knowledge of Valerie Hardik's visit to their home that day. Law enforcement's first priority was to locate Hardik, who had fled the scene after the shooting. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen her or knew where she might have gone. Witnesses reported seeing a woman matching Hardik's description leaving the area on foot shortly after the gunshot was heard. This information, combined with other initial leads, helped police narrow their search. Detectives quickly focused on establishing a timeline of events leading up to the shooting. Through phone records, social media activity, and witness statements, they reconstructed the hours before Shelby's death. It became clear that Valerie Hardik had arrived at the Von Holdt home with a specific purpose. Her erratic behavior in the days leading up to the incident suggested that she might have been struggling with worsening mental health issues. Friends and acquaintances described her as increasingly paranoid and unpredictable, though no one could have imagined the violence she would unleash. As the investigation progressed, details about Hardik's background began to emerge. She was a young woman with a history of mental health challenges, including episodes of psychosis and erratic decision-making. Friends and family noted that she had struggled to maintain stable relationships and often seemed consumed by personal struggles. Despite these challenges, there were no clear warning signs that she was capable of murder. The search for Hardik intensified as police issued a warrant for her arrest. Local news outlets began broadcasting her name and description, urging the public to report any sightings. The community of Fort Wayne was on edge, knowing that a dangerous suspect was still at large. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, following up on tips and pursuing leads to bring her into custody. In addition to the manhunt, forensic teams examined the scene of the crime for crucial evidence. They recovered the bullet that had struck Shelby and began analyzing fingerprints and other physical evidence left behind. Detectives also reviewed Shelby's personal belongings and communications to determine if there was any prior conflict with Hardik. However, nothing concrete suggested that Shelby had anticipated any danger that day. Hardik's mental state became a key point of focus in the investigation. Police consulted with experts to better understand the possible motivations behind her actions. While there were no clear indications of premeditation, the fact that she arrived at Shelby's home armed with a firearm raised significant questions. Was the murder an impulsive act, or had Hardik planned it in advance? The community's reaction to the case was one of shock and outrage. Shelby Von Holdt was well-liked and had no known enemies. Her senseless murder left friends and neighbors struggling to comprehend how such a tragedy could occur. Vigils were held in her memory, and calls for justice echoed throughout the area. After several days of intense searching, law enforcement finally tracked down Valerie Hardik. She was apprehended 50 kilometers away in a nearby town. The police had been called severally by people at a gas station store about a young woman who was trying to peep at customers' credit card information as they tried to pay for their items. She had also pointed a gun at an elderly man in some other part of the town as well, and calls had been made to the police about a young woman threatening people with a gun. The police swooped in, and she was arrested. Her arrest brought a sense of relief to the community, though it also marked the beginning of a lengthy legal process. Valerie Hardik's arrest on charges of murder marked a turning point in the investigation into Shelby Von Holdt's tragic death. Captured at a relative's home, She was taken into custody without resistance, and her demeanor was described as calm, almost detached. This behavior immediately raised questions about her mental state. After being booked at the local jail, detectives began the critical process of questioning Hardik to gain insight into her motives and the events leading up to the shooting. During her initial interviews, Hardik offered inconsistent explanations about what had occurred that day. At times, she denied being at Shelby's house. At other moments, she claimed that her actions were justified, although she didn't elaborate on why. Detectives noted her erratic behavior and lack of clarity in answering questions. As the interrogation continued, it became evident that her mental health would be a significant factor in the case. The legal system moved swiftly to bring charges against Hardik. She was formally indicted on charges of first-degree murder, which carried the possibility of a life sentence. Prosecutors argued that her actions were deliberate, pointing to evidence that she had brought a firearm to Shelby's home. While they acknowledged her history of mental health struggles, they were determined to pursue justice for Shelby and her grieving family. Meanwhile, the defense team faced the challenging task of representing Hardik. They immediately began exploring the possibility of an insanity defense, citing her long history of mental health issues. Hardik had been diagnosed with several conditions in the past, including bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, and had received treatment intermittently. Her defense attorneys argued that her ability to discern right from wrong at the time of the crime was severely impaired. As the pretrial hearings began, more details about the case were revealed. Evidence collected from the crime scene, including the firearm used in the shooting, was presented to the court. Prosecutors also submitted witness statements from neighbors who had seen Hardik flee the scene, further solidifying their timeline of events. The defense, on the other hand, requested a psychological evaluation for Hardik, which the judge granted. The evaluation became a key focus for both sides. Mental health professionals were tasked with assessing whether Hardik was competent to stand trial and whether she could be held criminally responsible for her actions. These evaluations involved a deep dive into her medical history, interviews with those who knew her, and extensive testing to determine her mental state at the time of the murder. As the case developed, Shelby's family faced the difficult reality of attending hearings and reliving the events surrounding her death. They remained a constant presence in the courtroom, advocating for justice. Shelby's parents were vocal about the devastating impact of her loss and the need to ensure that Hardik was held accountable. Their strength and determination resonated with the community, which continued to rally around them. The media also played a significant role in shaping public opinion about the case. News outlets covered every development, from Hardik's arrest to the pretrial motions. Public reaction was mixed. While some viewed Hardik as a cold-blooded killer, others sympathized with her struggles and questioned whether the mental health system had failed her. As the trial date approached, tensions grew. Both sides prepared to present their case to the jury, knowing that the outcome would have lasting implications for everyone involved. Prosecutors were confident in their evidence, but they also understood the complexities of addressing mental health in the courtroom. The defense, meanwhile, focused on building a narrative that emphasized Hardik's instability and lack of intent. The trial of Valerie Hardik began amidst significant public attention, with the courtroom filled to capacity each day. Shelby Von Holdt's family sat in the front row, determined to see justice served, while Hardik's legal team prepared to present their defense. Both sides knew the stakes were high, not just for Hardik, but for the community that had been shaken by Shelby's death. The prosecution's case focused on establishing premeditation and intent. They argued that Hardik's decision to bring a firearm to Shelby's home, confront her, and ultimately pull the trigger demonstrated a clear and deliberate plan. The prosecutor presented forensic evidence, including ballistics linking the firearm to the fatal shot and a timeline of events that placed Hardik at the scene. Witness testimony from neighbors and first responders reinforced the gravity of the situation, painting a chilling picture of the moments immediately following Shelby's death. Shelby's family members were also called to testify, recounting the devastating impact of her loss. They described her as a kind-hearted, vibrant young woman who had her entire future ahead of her. Their testimony was emotional and powerful, reminding the jury of the human cost of Hardik's actions. The defense, however, sought to shift the focus to Hardik's mental state at the time of the crime. They argued that her long history of mental health struggles, including diagnoses of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, had impaired her ability to think rationally or understand the consequences of her actions. They called on mental health professionals who had evaluated Hardik both before and after the incident to testify about her instability. These experts described her history of psychotic episodes, erratic behavior, and untreated symptoms that had worsened in the weeks leading up to Shelby's death. In an attempt to further support their case, the defense highlighted the lack of consistent mental health care that Hardik had received. They pointed to gaps in her treatment history, arguing that systemic failures had contributed to her decline. Hardik's attorney framed her as a tragic figure who was a victim of her own mental illness, rather than a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution pushed back against this narrative, challenging the credibility of the insanity defense. They emphasized that Hardik had the presence of mind to flee the scene after the shooting, dispose of the weapon, and avoid capture for several days. These actions, they argued, demonstrated an awareness of guilt and an attempt to evade responsibility. The prosecutor also pointed out that Hardik had made specific threats toward Shelby prior to the shooting, which indicated a motive rooted in jealousy and anger. Throughout the trial, Shelby's family remained composed but visibly emotional. Their grief was palpable, and their determination to see Hardik held accountable resonated with many in the courtroom. The community continued to rally behind them, attending proceedings and offering support as they faced the harrowing details of Shelby's final moments. As closing arguments approached, both sides prepared to make their final appeals to the jury. The prosecution urged jurors to focus on the evidence of premeditation and intent, while the defense implored them to consider Hardik's mental illness and its impact on her actions. The jury's decision would ultimately hinge on whether they believed Hardik was capable of understanding right from wrong at the time of the crime. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Valerie Hardik was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Shelby Von Holdt. The decision brought a mix of emotions to those in the courtroom. Shelby's family wept openly, feeling a sense of justice for their daughter and sister, though it could never undo the loss they had suffered. The prosecution expressed relief, confident that the evidence presented had convinced the jury of Hardik's intent and culpability. Hardik was sentenced to the maximum time possible under the Indiana law in cases like these. She was sentenced to 65 years in prison. The judge, in delivering the sentence, emphasized the calculated nature of her actions and the devastating impact they had on Shelby's family and the community at large. While the defense team expressed disappointment, they acknowledged that the case had presented significant challenges, particularly in persuading the jury of the severity of Hardik's mental illness. The conclusion of the trial marked the end of a painful chapter for Shelby's family, but the emotional wounds remained raw. In the months that followed, they focused on preserving Shelby's memory through advocacy and charitable efforts. They established a foundation in her name, aimed at supporting victims of domestic violence and promoting mental health awareness. For them, it was a way to channel their grief into something positive, hoping to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The case also reignited discussions about the intersection of mental illness and the justice system. Some questioned whether Hardik's condition had been adequately considered, while others argued that her actions could not be excused, regardless of her mental health challenges. The debate highlighted the complexities of balancing accountability with compassion in cases involving mental illness. For the local community, the trial and its outcome served as a sobering reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. Shelby's death left an indelible mark on those who knew her, as well as on those who had followed the case from afar. Her story became a call to action for greater awareness of the warning signs of violence and the importance of seeking help before tragedy strikes. In the end, Shelby Von Holdt's legacy became more than just the tragedy of her untimely death. Her family's efforts to honor her life ensured that her story would continue to inspire change and bring hope to others. As the years passed, her memory remained a beacon for those working to make their communities safer and more supportive for everyone. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to be notified as we add new videos daily. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.